Good morning and welcome to episode 61 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined, as I am every Thursday, by the brilliant Mia O'Brien. You can catch her every weekday on Helmets and Heels from 12 to 2 p.m. on 1010XL /92.5 FM radio in Jacksonville. Today, Mia and I are going to talk about, we were planning on talking about general managers because not necessarily next on the list, but one of the next big items for Liam Cohen and the Jaguars to figure out is who will be the general manager. But we did get some breaking news late last night. I don't know why all of the Jaguars news this cycle is breaking late at night when I'm already asleep, but it is what it is.
Can I just note, Gus, for those of you who followed my work for years here in Jacksonville, I've been here 6+ years. And even if you don't follow the Jags, but you follow me, because Gus and I are now live streaming from our personal Twitters. So you may just be a Mia fan, and here you are. For the first 31 years of my life, Gus Logue, I was nightside in the local news world. I was going to bed at 1 a.m, sleeping until 9 or 10 because I wouldn't go to work till 1 p.m. And the moment that I decide to turn over a new leaf, my New Year's resolution is part of the leadership program that I also teach in, that I'm going to wake up at 6:30 a.m. every morning. This morning, I was up at 5:45 to get to a workout class. And now the Jaguars have a 39-year-old head coach, Gus, who loves to drop news at 11:30 p.m. In a previous life, I'd be wide awake at that hour. But here we are.
Yeah. I'm honestly right there with you. But yeah, the 39-year-old hired a 29-year-old. Grant Udinski is the new offensive coordinator. He comes over from Minnesota. We're going to get into our reactions for that and then go over some general manager candidates. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. The big news for today, I'll break it at the end of the show too, but I figured I'll do both the beginning and the end. We are going live 5 days a week, starting next week, starting at 9:04 each show. I personally didn't love how one show was noon, one show was 9:04, just because I was afraid that some listeners, it would be the lack of consistency I didn't love. But now we're going to have all consistency, 9:04, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. I'll be here. Mia will still be here on Thursdays. We've got a great lineup. We're going to have national guests coming in on Wednesday. It's going to be great. So, again, I'll remind everyone at the end of this episode, but looking forward to going from 2 weekdays to 5 weekdays starting next week here on Duval Rundown. And then before we get to the offense coordinator, it's time for some trivia. I prepared a GM-type question. So, Mia, which former Jaguars general manager had the worst winning percentage? Tom Coughlin was technically the de facto general manager until 2002. He's not on this list. So your options are A, James Harris, B, Gene Smith, C, Dave Caldwell, or D, Trent Baalke. Who had the worst winning percentage of those four general managers?
I just can't get over that you wrote James Harris and not Shaq Harris. Like, I'm not going to lie. I saw that. And I'm like, who's that?
He's not in my era. But I know his nickname is Shaq.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't my era either. I was in elementary and middle school at that point. But either way, I'm going to go with Gene Smith. But something tells me it's actually Trent Baalke.
No, it's actually Dave Caldwell had the lowest record. But I don't want to – I'm not trying to crap on Dave. I think he actually –
We love Dave.
I mean, he assembled the single best team, the 2017, out of any of the Shad Khan teams since 2012. And then a lot of the work that Trent Baalke was able to do was because of assets that kind of Dave Caldwell loaded up for him. And so Dave Caldwell, technically the lowest winning percentage of any Jaguars general manager, but I don't think it was as bad as it sounds. So looking forward to talking with you, Mia, about who the Jaguars' next general manager could be. But first, let's hit this news of Grant Udinski from Minnesota. Instant reaction. What have you heard about him before today, and what have you heard about him since?
Yeah, so I actually was just texting with some of our contemporaries up in Minneapolis, and Kevin O'Connell has maintained over the last 3 years that he expected Grant Udinski to one day become an offensive coordinator and a head coach. And here we are. He's not even 30 years old, and he is an offensive coordinator, albeit not a play calling one, in the National Football League. And so I want to begin with kind of the build up to this, Gus. I know that Aaron Wilson, friend of the program, friend of mine with KPRC in Houston, reported over the weekend that Nate Scheelhaus, the Rams passing game specialist, was the front runner for this position. I don't know if that's true or not, but what I can tell you is in connecting dots last night, it was not a surprise to me. And if anything, it's a feather in Liam Cohen's cap that Nate Fieldhouse made the decision to stay with the Rams because Aaron's report came out on Sunday. And on Monday, Nick Caley, the passing game coordinator for the Rams, who has been extremely selective in choosing an OC position, took the offer with the Houston Texans to become their next offensive coordinator. And so we've already heard from the NFL Network report that Nate Fieldhouse is going to have an elevated title now with the Rams. And so that says to me, he was trying to play his cards right. And yes, there will be those of you who say, well, he turned down an OC job for a passing game coordinator. Yes, but it's a non-play calling OC.
Right. That's not a big thing.
Head coach versus working for a Super Bowl winning head coach who, if you play your cards right as the passing game coordinator, you'll be the next Nick Caley and you'll have an OC offer next off season. And so I think it was a shrewd move by Fieldhouse that, quite frankly, I don't think Liam Cohen was surprised by. If anything, he's helping a mutual friend get a pay bump, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's good business. But Grant Udinski, I know from speaking with folks who were close to the Seattle situation when they were hiring their offensive coordinator, which ultimately landed with the hire of Clint Kubiak, formerly with the New Orleans Saints. Grant Udinski blew people away in his interview as one of three finalists. Hank Fraley, the offensive line coach for the Detroit Lions, was the third finalist. And so I've heard nothing but great things over the last few weeks in a weird way, Gus. And so I'm very excited to talk about the GM candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Have come out of the woodwork to talk to me about Grant Udinski, independent of the Jags, by the way. Like, this was before the Jaguars requested him for an OC interview.
Yeah.
People coming out of the woodwork to tell me about him in the same vein as they have come out of the woodwork to tell me about James Gladstone with the Los Angeles Rams. And so I'm not saying that, I just want all the young cats. Hayes Carline, who's going to be joining you every Tuesday on Duval Rundown, has been vocal that, and I've gotten texts from friends around the league as well. They're like, are they going to hire an adult? Like, what are we doing? At the same time, I really have to text this league source because I have to tell him that I've quoted him like 8 times on radio this week. I just go back to a conversation I had after the Jaguars got blown out by the Detroit Lions. And this person said to me, they've just got to go young. They've got to go college. They've got to go take their lumps, but go where the league is headed. And that's what they're doing. And so I don't understand the pushback from some in Jacksonville right now.
Yeah, I was definitely at first like all aboard the Patrick Graham train specifically for defensive coordinator, mostly because of his experience. I'm definitely on the boat where, like, even though Ron Rivera took the job with his alma mater, Cal, to be their general manager. Haven't heard anything about Don Brown. I feel like there was another like potential senior advisor that we heard about, but didn't end up happening. And so I'm still in the belief that the Jaguars should hire some kind of senior advisor. Like Don Brown would probably be perfect for that role. But I mean, now that we've gotten through the process, I'm kind of drinking the Kool-Aid of what Liam Cohen is doing, because at first I thought it would be smart to do what Sean McVay originally did and had his Wade Phillips and just kind of hand the keys to the defense over to him. But I don't know, I guess what I originally thought was that since Liam Cohen is inexperienced, he needs people in the building who know what they're doing. But from what the hiring process has looked like, it seems like Liam Cohen knows what he's doing. And more importantly than that, he knows what he's looking for. And so I mentioned this on Tuesday's show too with Rick, but it just stands out to me that Liam clearly has like a certain philosophy and a certain type of coach that he's looking for. I think all of these coaches are young and energetic teachers of football. I think that's definitely the common theme on both the offensive and the defensive side of the ball. And then I agree with you about Shieldhouse. I don't even think it's necessarily just a Shieldhouse situation, but I know that Jags fans have been getting a little bit worried about how long this offensive coordinator search took. But it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone because obviously Liam Cohen is a 39-year-old, so he doesn't have all the connections that an older head coach might have. And then he had a lot of interviews blocked by Tampa Bay. And now because he is calling offensive plays, that makes the offensive coordinator job in Jacksonville a little bit less attractive. But, I mean, this offensive coordinator that they did hire, 29-year-old Grant Udinski, definitely seems like the real deal. He's been with the Vikings since 2022. He was hired on Kevin O'Connell's original staff. Before that, he was with the Panthers under Matt Rule because he got his start in coaching as a graduate assistant at Baylor under Matt Rule. But he's been great. Alec Lewis, who's the Vikings beat reporter for The Athletic, tweeted this is a tough loss for the Vikings. Grant Udinski had been integral to Kevin O'Connell's process the last few years, was huge with the quarterback room this past year too. And so, yeah, he's done great work. Sam Darnold was the first quarterback in NFL history to win 14 games in his first season with the new team. And then back in 2023, the Vikings won 3 consecutive games with 3 different quarterbacks. They had Kirk Cousins, Jaren Hall, and Josh Dobbs. And so definitely a lot of things that we're hearing behind the scenes are great. But then even the work that Kevin O'Connell and Grant Udinski and the Minnesota Vikings have done with their quarterbacks to turn around several different careers has been great. And so, I mean, the name of the game is Trevor Lawrence at the end of the day. And so I feel confident that this hire is going to help Trevor Lawrence. And so for that reason, I'm pretty bullish on it.
Just a 4-year age gap between Grant Udinski and Trevor Lawrence, which if that doesn't say where the Jags are headed, I don't know what does. Grant took on the role of mentor, big brother for JJ McCarthy, in addition to essentially being whatever Sam Darnold needed him to be this past season. And obviously, like you noted, Gus, the results, the fruits of the labor are there. I love this nugget. This is from Ben Gosling of the Star Tribune. Here's a quote from Josh McCown, the quarterback's coach with the Vikings, who many people believe will one day become an NFL head coach, if not an NFL OC. He said, quote, "He reminds me a ton of Kevin O'Connell when I had him as my quarterback's coach in 2015 with the Browns. You could tell immediately with his presence and intellect he was going to be a really good coach. That is what I feel from Grant." And then O'Connell then is quoted as saying, "Won't surprise me if he's on a pretty skyrocketed timeline when I'm working for you years from now. Please go easy on me, no matter how I treat you right now."
Yeah, that was a great analysis or a great article feature on Udinski in the Minnesota Star Tribune. Definitely recommend everyone check that out by Ben Gosling. The other nugget that I saw in there was that Kevin O'Connell said nobody loves football like Udinski. And so, yeah,
I have one that the stats and info department, aka Kevin, found for us. So Kevin O'Connell tells the story of, like, if Grant Udinski's not coaching football, he's probably hiking a mountain in Colorado and he's like sleeping in like a sleeping bag, like not in a cabin or like a luxurious hotel. Like that's just who he is. Apparently, Grant Udinski, when he first took the GA job at Baylor, lived in his car for the first week of being a GA and just didn't tell anyone until one of Matt Rule's senior assistants found out and was like, "Yeah, no, you're going to come live with me and my family because that's weird." So this is a guy, like, he's all ball and he wants the job and he just wants to be there. And that's his focus, which again, I go back to, for those of you who I see, Zenith is asking about the zero gray hair coaching staff. What was the biggest issue that we had in Jacksonville? The idea of, number one, coaches who were just not checked out, because I would say Doug Marrone in 2020, like that's much more of a quote unquote checked out situation, or even Urban Meyer in 2021 compared to Doug Peterson. But the point is that the juice was lacking. And secondly, if we go back to 2023, what was the reason that defensive staff was fired? Quite frankly, it was because of lack of accountability and coaches that would leave the building at 6:00 and say, "Here's your packet, go home and do your homework." In reality, the modern player cannot be trusted to be that disciplined. Yes, there are exceptions to it. And yes, you hope you are drafting those exceptions. But a young 21-year-old, 22-year-old to just hand them a packet and say, "Okay, take your iPad and go home and watch this." If they don't have that guidance, then they are never going to get to where they need to be. You need coaches who are okay with working those late night hours until 11:30 at night. Those coaches that are okay running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, as crazy as it sounds. That is the name of the game in the National Football League right now, and that's what Liam Cohen's building.
Yeah, I thought when I was looking over Ben Johnson as a head coach candidate, he was kind of in the same boat as Liam Cohen, where like the big pro is that he's an offensive genius, wonderkin, boy genius, whatever. And then the potential negative is like, oh, can he lead a locker room? But like there was a lot of really good quotes from a lot of different Lions players, but there was one from Amon-Ra St. Brown that especially stood out to me, where Amon-Ra said, like, "I know that Ben Johnson is grinding away and that he's working as hard as possible. So when he stands at the front of the positional meeting room or in front of the whole team, I trust him because I know he's put the work in." And so like you don't necessarily have to be a Dan Campbell rah guy in order to get people's trust and belief in you. I think that Liam Cohen has a similar thing where, like, because players understand how hard he's working to put them in the best positions to succeed, he doesn't necessarily have to have the greatest pregame and halftime and postgame speeches of all time. And I think that's kind of been like the same deal as kind of with the entire coaching staff too, where I think, probably the defensive coordinator and his staff, Anthony Campanile, is probably a little bit of a motivator and a yeller and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like, everyone is a young coach who is trying as hard as they can, and just that fact alone is going to make players like them. And so, yeah, I'm excited, and I think that they did the right thing by kind of not looking for someone who's been at the top of the mountain before. I mentioned this a few shows ago, but they got Urban Meyer, they got Doug Peterson. They had gotten a lot of people who had already been there, done that, and so they probably weren't necessarily motivated, or as motivated at least, to get back to the top of the mountain. And so I do like that they have so many young
and hungry, baby.
Young and hungry. We're on the way up the mountain instead of down. And so that's good.
Why y'all are tuned into Duval Rundown right now. We're young and hungry. And that's even though we both got called old in the 1010XL multimedia group chat because we were not awake at 11:30 last night when the news broke about Grant Udinski.
For sure. The one other thing I wanted to say about Udinski is that even though he is 29 years old and his official title last year was assistant quarterbacks coach and assistant offensive coordinator, he did interview for 4 different offensive coordinator positions outside of Jacksonville: the Seahawks, the Buccaneers, the Texans, and the Patriots. And so it's not like this is a complete nobody. Like, if you do your research or if you just listen to the show, you know that Grant Udinski is a rising star and was going to be an offense coordinator in just a matter of time. And so I don't want anyone to be like, oh, well, they couldn't find anyone to hire, so they had to go to someone who's under 30 years old. No, they're doing it the right way. And so let's get to general managers. There are 7 official candidates right now, but Tony Boselli did go on Radio Row at Super Bowl yesterday, and he said in an interview with, I forget what it was.
Sky Sports, I thought.
It wasn't Sky Sports. It was another UK-based program. It was like something sports. But he said that there are 9 external candidates the Jaguars are considering and a couple of internal candidates, including Ethan Wall. So that'll bring the total up to maybe close to a dozen. But again, there are 7 official candidates that we know of. And so those are the ones that we're going to run through today. To go through those names real quick, it's Chicago Bears assistant general manager Ian Cunningham, New York Giants assistant general manager Brandon Brown, Los Angeles Chargers assistant general manager Chad Alexander, Cincinnati Bengals senior personnel executive Trey Brown, Los Angeles Rams director of scouting James Gladstone, San Francisco 49ers director of scouting and football operations Josh Williams, and Jacksonville Jaguars assistant general manager and interim general manager Ethan Waugh. Mia, where do you want to start here? It was TalkSport. Thank you to Brandon Young on YouTube. TalkSport was where Tony Boselli appeared yesterday.
Which the Brits, man, like TalkSport, what an original name for a programming channel. But love the Brits. Let's begin with who many of us, including both of us here on this podcast, have reported now for several weeks is considered to be the favorite for the job, which is Ian Cunningham, the assistant general manager for the Chicago Bears. Yes, as I've said a time or two on this pod, and that's why we'll quickly run through his resume. He has been rumored to be a candidate for this job if it was to have been that clean sweep, that complete overhaul where a new head coach was allowed to come in with a new GM and be co-builders of the Jacksonville Jaguars into the future. He was considered the favorite since November behind backdoor, closed doors, in back channels. So not a surprise that, needless to say, he was among the first 5 names requested. He grew up in the Baltimore, well, I shouldn't say he grew up, but his formative scouting years were with Ozzie Newsome and the Baltimore Ravens scouting department before being plucked by Howie Roseman and spending the next couple years in the Philadelphia Eagles system before his old friend Ryan Poles plucked him away to become his assistant general manager and his number 2 for the Chicago Bears. Now, Cunningham did play college football at the University of Virginia. So obviously he's a guy who played, you wouldn't realize he played offensive. I believe he did play offensive line, which if you looked at him, you wouldn't think he did. Him and Ryan Poles are skinny men now, relatively speaking. But anywho, point is he played the game. He knows. And so I think that because he was offered the Arizona Cardinals position, or at the very least declined it, pulled himself out of the process, rumored to have done the same with the Tennessee Titans, has obviously been in the cycle for the last 2 off seasons. He's a name that's very familiar to folks. And that's why I think so many believe he is not only a front runner, but it is his time.
Yeah, he's definitely one of the guys where it's a matter of time until he becomes a general manager. And as Rick and I talked about on Tuesday's show, or at least to me, like the biggest thing that stands out when going over potential general manager candidates is their experience in which specific buildings that they've been in. And so the Ravens building and the Eagles building are potentially the two best buildings to be in order to learn scouting and learn how to be a general manager. Cunningham won Super Bowls with the Ravens in 2012 and then with the Eagles in 2017. And so I think he's done good work with the Bears too in recent years for sure, but just the overall body of work is definitely, I think, the exciting thing about Ian Cunningham. So we got 6 more names to get through, and we've already spent 20 minutes. So Mia, who do you want to hit on next?
Yeah, we'll couple a couple of these names together because we noted them on our GM of Thrones episode that we did, that I just want to once again state on the record. Gus and I were not trying to get Trent Baalke fired. It just so happened we threw that episode out there to say, like, hey, you know, let's say they make a clean sweep change late in the process. Who would it be? Let's say the head coach comes in, but brings someone with him. Who could those names be? And so, as you guys may recall, and if you didn't listen to that episode, you can go listen on demand. We broke it down into tiers. And so the other 2 names that were in the tier with Ian Cunningham that I first heard as potential names, not only for the Jaguars, but for any opening this cycle, Chad Alexander, the number 2 with the Los Angeles Chargers, who also began his career with the Baltimore Ravens, then went to the New York Jets to be their number 3 before old friend Joe Ortiz plucked him and brought him to Southern California. Heard from multiple people throughout the league this week. Not only does Alexander have a ton of respect for what his dad did as a longtime coach in the National Football League, but just a respected mind when it comes to scouting and football IQ. And that's from multiple people, both in media, former coaches, current. I've heard it from a couple different people. So I honestly think Chad Alexander should be a name you guys should keep in mind, because I do think he, even if it's not the job here, he is going to get a GM job at some point. Brandon Brown is the other name that I put in that tier back in that episode a few weeks ago, the assistant GM for the Giants, who, yes, I know you hear the Giants and you're like, oh my God, they're awful. He can't be good. He came to the Giants from the Philadelphia Eagles, was part of a Super Bowl championship. So I would say his background is pretty good. So I would put all of them in that tier of they've got next. And it was not a surprise that all 3 were among the first 5 names requested. Now, of course, the first name requested, Mike Greenberg, has since pulled his name out of the process. Not going to go into that. We spent enough time on Helmets and Heels talking about that yesterday. You could go back and watch on demand, hear me rant about Jason Licht and his insecurities and trying to talk to trolls on Twitter. Like, Jason, you're better than that. So we won't even get into Mikey Greenberg. But then the next few names, Gus, I think are the ones we need to try to introduce our audience to a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Brandon Brown from the Giants was a finalist for the Chargers and the Panthers general manager jobs last year. He's also interviewed.
He also was like in the cycle, much
like
and
so like kind of the same deal as Cunningham, at least from my end. It's like
that's why they're all in that tier.
Next guys up, and they've been in winning fantastic organizations, and so for that, like, yeah, point for them. But I mean, who are some of these other names that you want to get to? I think Trey Brown is really interesting because the Bengals.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, if you want to dive into Trey Brown, yes.
Even if I don't even know necessarily a lot about Trey Brown specifically, but I do think that what the Bengals have done in recent years is pretty impressive. I know that the past year or two, they've been a little bit on the downslope, but when they went to the Super Bowl, they did have the benefit of Joe Burrow being on a rookie deal. But even with a great rookie quarterback or rookie deal quarterback and Joe Burrow, it still takes a lot to build a roster that can make it all the way to the Super Bowl. And he definitely gets a lot of credit for that. And especially when you consider that Cincinnati is probably the cheapest organization in the league in terms of spending money in general, but also spending money on players and bringing new players into the building. I think certainly anyone from Cincinnati should be worth a look. And Trey Brown, who's the senior personnel executive, seems to be at the top of the list.
I do agree with Hef in the comments. The irony is not lost on me that the Bengals defensive talent, especially their DBs, it's been suspect at times, which is hilarious because Trey Brown was a DB in the National Football League and at UCLA. So that part is kind of funny to me. But no, I do think that he is a name certainly that not only was among the finalists for the New York Jets job this past cycle, but is that next tier below those 3 we already referenced in terms of he's going to now be a finalist. he's going to be in the conversation for these GM jobs ahead. The next name that I want to hit, Gus, is Josh Williams, another name we've brought up here on the podcast before. He's the 49ers director of scouting and football operations. He was, once upon a time, hired by Trent Baalke in San Francisco. Yes, folks, that's why in our GM of Thrones episode, we had him a couple tiers below the Ian Cunningham, Brandon Brown, Chad Alexander tier, because my expectation was that he may be a name to come in and flesh out the front office if Trent Baalke was to stick around. Instead, once Mike Greenberg pulls his name, almost instantly we hear that Josh Williams has been requested for an interview. And so he's a guy who has a lot of respect around the league, played at Columbia, is from the California area. So that's why would be an interesting fit, just because he has spent the last however many years really focusing on the West Coast, although he was the Southeast area scout once upon a time, which, if you believe Ozzie Newsome, you don't just make anybody the Southeast area scout, regardless of what team you're working for, because obviously the SEC is paramount in the scouting world. And so obviously had the support of one John Lynch, who not only retained him, but then gave him that elevated title and gave him that job that is so coveted in the scouting world. And so this past season was his first year as the director of scouting and football operations. And so that director title is still somewhat new. He's just 37 years old. And so again, another young name that could fit into the mix one way or another, because the last name, yes, we saved James Gladstone for last, because he is the one that people have been coming out of the woodwork to talk to me about. So I do want to reserve him for the end. But I do think, as much as people are saying Gus on Twitter at the very least, but I think a lot of Jaguar fans, even if you're not on Twitter, are echoing this. The idea of, well, what if you take one of those tier one guys and you make James Gladstone your assistant GM? I will tell you, I have heard from multiple people. They believe the 34-year-old Gladstone is ready for the main seat, for the main show. Whereas I look at Josh Williams and I say, maybe this is the guy who you bring in as an assistant GM or a director of player personnel if you want to continue to flesh this front office out with folks from different organizations and different ideas.
One thing I'm really interested to see, too, is who's going to be the salary cap guru or wizard for the Jaguars. I mean, maybe they kind of already have someone or a couple people in the building that they're going to end up retaining. But one positive for Williams is that he does assist with contract negotiations, which is a big deal in San Francisco because, I mean, again, it helps having Brock Purdy on a rookie contract, but they have so many superstars out there that they had to give big money to, including Deebo Samuel, who, even if that contract isn't looking great right now, Williams was apparently the area scout who identified Deebo coming out of college at South Carolina. And he was turned out to be a second-round pick and then an all-pro player. And so, yeah, I think Williams is also the first name that we've dove into so far that has not worked in the Eagles organization. And so that's just a common theme to keep an eye on. But let's get to Gladstone. Mia, what excites you most about the young Rams hotshot?
Man, oh man, where do I begin? Like I said, Gus, people have been coming out of the woodwork to tell me about this guy. Like, I got to get my phone out so I can read some of this to y'all, because it's, again, like, I didn't ask for this. Like, truly, I did not ask for, hey, tell me about Mr. Gladstone, right? I've texted one person and said, hey, tell me about this kid. I want to read this from one person I talked to in the league, because it's so true. How many people have been with the Rams through a whole years-long build, shoulder to shoulder with the general manager? Brad Holmes, James Gladstone. Those are the two individuals who were with Les Snead when the team moved from St. Louis to Los Angeles, hired a young, fiery Sean McVay, and built that organization not only into a Super Bowl champion in 2021, but also this new iteration that sees a defensive front that is as ferocious as anybody's, and also they're all on rookie contracts. So he had a big hand in that. From what I've been told, he has a lot of Les Snead in him, wakes up sprinting, is ready to hit the ground running. He actually began, and part of how Les Snead found him, he began his post-grad career as an offensive coordinator at Westminster College where he played. So he actually has coached. So for everyone who used to joke about Trent Baalke walking around with the whistle, I don't think that James Gladstone's ever going to do that. But at the same time, no offense, but I know Trent was a GA once upon a time, but like, he's got more street cred than Trent to do that, quite frankly, in my estimation. And people love this guy. They believe that not only does he have the confidence to be in the big chair, but that he can command a room. And I encourage you guys to check out the Rams in-house media and the wonderful behind the scenes videos that they've been able to put together, where he is at 33 years old last year. He's the one, the weekend before the draft, all the scouts who are double, triple his age, that they're all sitting in the room and he has their respect. And so that, for me, the fact that we already have, and I know it's a 30-second clip, but we have that tangible evidence, that says to me that, hey, this kid maybe can do the job. And if the focus is young, innovative, no one has the title of director of scouting strategy in the National Football League besides James Gladstone. Scouting strategy. That's what Jaguar fans have been clamoring about for years.
Yeah, he's so interesting to me, especially because of the connection with Liam Cohen. They technically overlapped in Los Angeles. I don't know how much interaction they necessarily had, but just the fact that they're from the same building. And if you heard Liam Cohen's introductory press conference from a couple weeks ago, he talked about how proud he was to be from the Sean McVay coaching tree and how, like, LA is where he got his PhD in football. But it's also, as he said, where he learned kind of how an organization is run and how an organization can be run kind of under the same vision. And so I think, obviously, if Gladstone ends up being hired, then should be pretty easy for him and Cohen to get on the same page in terms of what exactly their vision is for building this new era of Jaguars football and how they're going to evaluate and bring in talent and all that. But yeah, the one nugget that I have on Gladstone is that apparently he and Rams area scout Vito Vanilla identified Puka Nacua as a must-have, who's a 5th-round pick. And so, yeah, just get a guy from a good organization for sure. But
one other that I
think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, one other that I just pulled up so I don't forget it. Someone described it to me as he changes the math in the best way possible. And again, I have lamented here on radio, in conversations with people around the league. This is supposed to be the bold city of the South, right? So why have we settled for vanilla for the better part of the last decade? Just want to throw that out there, folks.
Yeah.
And don't be scared, because in the words of one Billy Napier, scared money don't make money. And I would just like to believe that Liam Cohen is not afraid of trying to do something bold and something different, especially with the nice 5-year contract that he's been given. He is going to try this. Shad Khan is behind this and wants to try it. Tony Baselli is behind it. And whoever this GM is going to be in lockstep with that.
Now, I did want to hit on one other name, Mia, because it's a name that people are the most familiar with, and it's Ethan Waugh, who is going to be not just an interviewee, but a finalist, according to Tony Baselli, because he, quote-unquote, earned it. I just want to talk about him, or at least get your thoughts on him, because to the vast majority of Jaguars fans, Ethan Waugh is a Baalke protege who's currently the interim general manager. And I think, obviously, since Baalke was at one point the interim general manager and then became the full Jaguars general manager, I think people are not necessarily like scared about it working out the way that Baalke worked out, but just because he has an association with Baalke, I think people are automatically turned off. And so, beyond his relationship with Baalke, what can you tell us about Ethan Waugh as a GM candidate?
Yeah. By the way, a couple of our colleagues came to me and they were like, "Hey, you're close with Ethan," and I'm like, "No, I think I'm just the only media member that I address him by his first name and he addresses me by my first name, just because I say hi to people. I don't know. So I don't have any sort of extra special relationship with him like the rest, like anybody else in the media. Point being, very pleasant. If anything, I just love to give Ethan Waugh flowers whenever I can, because while doing the dirty work out in San Francisco for almost a decade, his family was still living in South Carolina and he was commuting on weekends during the off season back to South Carolina. Now, granted, some of that stemmed from him being a scout, and so therefore you can kind of live in different parts of the country. You don't have to necessarily live where the NFL operation you're working for is. And so that just always said to me, like, this is a guy who he's very serious about the job. Very pleasant demeanor, as you guys have probably heard in his limited availabilities. He is certainly, by all reports, especially from Tony Boselli, who we know was in the room, was integral in getting Liam Cohen to change his mind and to come back to the Jacksonville Jaguars and reconsider. I know that he's been involved so far in this process as they've not only spoken with and interviewed candidates for the staff, but also compiling this list of general manager names. Obviously, it's made a little bit more complicated by the fact that he is a candidate, so I don't think he's going to have as much of a role now, but he's been integral in getting this operation for Liam Cohen off the ground running, and it'll be curious because, it's a very interesting time that we live in right now, Gus. Again, I go back to, and I want to be very careful as I say this, which now you're all going to lean in closer because you're going to be like, oh boy, here she goes. Because Liam Cohen is being so bold, because he is unafraid to hire these young cats, because Tony Boselli and Shad Khan have said we need to do things differently, there are a lot of people still in town who are struggling with that. And whether that be folks who are from 4 regimes ago, whether they're non-football people living here in this city, there are people who view this in a different light than I do. And so therefore, I hear a little bit of everything, and then I make my assessment that I bring to you guys on the air. And so I am genuinely very curious, given what I just said, how Liam Cohen and Tony Boselli, how they do view Ethan Waugh in this process. Because from my vantage point and from everything they've said in public, he's been integral. Now, have I heard otherwise behind the scene? But again, like I said, not everyone's on board with 29-year-old OC, potential 34-year-old. Like, not everyone's on board with that. And so that's where, just again, for the sake of full transparency for you guys, that's where this has been one of the more fascinating coaching searches and now a GM search I've covered in 6+ years covering the league, because the owner, the new EVP, and the head coach are doing things unlike this town has ever seen. And there is very much, I don't want to say generational gap. I'm not ageist, even though we joked about it on Helmets and Heels yesterday. But there is not just a sentiment here in Jacksonville, but an old guard sentiment around the league of like, what are they doing in Jacksonville? Which I find funny. And Gus, you can speak to this, because when Jonathan Gannon did it with Arizona and continues to do it by hiring the Ohio State offensive line coach, no one bats an eye. But here it's scorned as like they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, we're gonna have to wait around for some results so that we can say "told you so." But yeah, I agree. It's Jonathan Gannon. Dan Campbell had the whole biting kneecaps thing. Like, there's a bunch of examples of people being a little bit awkward during press conference, like introductory press conferences or first team meetings. But it doesn't really matter what we think. It really matters what the players think, and that's definitely Liam Cohen and Tony Boselli's priority is help the players in that locker room as best as they can. And so, yeah, as I said, only time will tell. But Mia, before we get out of here, I don't know if you had any lingering thoughts. People were asking earlier about the offensive line coach. Mm-hmm. There was another question. I forget what it was. But anything on that, anything on Myles Garrett? I'm shocked by the amount of Jaguars fans saying that the Jags shouldn't pursue him. Like, if you don't want him, if you don't want the Jags to pursue Myles Garrett because you would rather keep the draft capital and your young players, then okay, like, sure, I'll hear that. But if you don't want to trade for Myles Garrett because you don't think Myles Garrett wants to come here, like, I don't know.
But guess what, Gus? But say that again, because that is, once again, we're just Jacksonville. Oh, we're a little old. Why do you have this complex, people? You're supposed to be the bold city of the South. Like, it just boggles my mind. You finally have been given carte blanche to be bold, and you still want to revert back to what you've always been. It boggles my mind.
Yeah. And I'll say Myles Garrett was making a lot of appearances on Radio Row at Super Bowl, which I think is just a further sign that he really wants to get out of Cleveland and will be traded regardless of what the Browns are putting out there in terms of, though we're not listening to offers. But he also said, Myles Garrett at Radio Row, that he wants to go somewhere with a good quarterback, because he said that you need a quarterback, not just a quarterback, but a good quarterback to consistently be a Super Bowl contender. And so I think that makes the Jaguars a viable option. Obviously, they would have to give up a pretty significant amount in order to get a superstar walking first ballot Hall of Famer like Myles Garrett. But to me, like the Jags have a lot of talent on the roster for sure, but like really Brian Thomas Jr. I think is the only one that's potentially like an all-pro superstar. They have just a lot of other stars, and so I don't know. I don't get why people are balking out like, oh, you wouldn't want to come here.
Right. Pull up John and Floyd's comments right now in the chat, Gus, because yes, it's like, oh no, that's Duval TV. Floyd says, yes, thank you, John, because Floyd, for those of you saying it, literally says because Myles Garrett wouldn't want to. Like, how do you know that?
Yeah.
You don't know that.
He's a good quarterback. Trevor Lawrence is a good quarterback. Like
the comp is Khalil Mack to the Bears. Khalil Mack going to the Bears? You think he thought the Bears were going to be going to the playoffs under Matt Nagy in year one? He had no idea. Like,
yeah, Myles Garrett is
like, come on.
He's not going to say, here are 5 teams I want to go to. I only want to go to the Chiefs and the Bills and the Niners and the Eagles and the Ravens. It's not that. He's going to be like, here are the 5 teams you can't trade me to. Like the teams that don't have a quarterback, just have no situation. Like the Raiders would be a good example. Even though I think they made a lot of great hires this offseason, the Raiders are very, very much rebuilding from an entire roster standpoint, and especially the quarterback. And so, yeah, I don't understand. Again, if you would rather hold on to picks and your players, then that's one thing. But to say that like Myles Garrett is not interested, I don't know. I guess we'll have to agree to disagree.
Or to just sit here, like, we could sit here and say it because we live here and this is how people look at us from the outside. Okay, well, you live here. I've lived in 4 or 5 other places. And yes, maybe that's the perception to some of you, but I can tell you this. There's a lot of Trevor Lawrence fans across the country right now who they want him to succeed. Trust me, random ass stations in Louisiana, in Tennessee, want to have me on to talk about Trevor because they all want to see Trevor be good. There are people who want to see Liam Cohen succeed. And so I don't buy this. The rest of the league and the rest of the country thinks that we're Jacksonville. Well, how about if you stop thinking like that? Maybe they will stop thinking like that. Just a thought. I know that there's a couple people, I think John, who's been clamoring in the chat for the offensive line coach. I know D-Rock reported, and I just want to get to that before we get out of here. Yeah. I know D-Rock reported, and now a lot of you are going to tie this together because of the Grant Udinski hire. Michael DeRocco reported that Minnesota assistant offensive line coach Sean Surratt interviewed for the O-line job. He obviously was in Minnesota with Grant Udinski. He was a one and done with Mike Tomlin, one of their worst run games that they've ever had. I haven't dove nearly enough into him. I have been told there's a couple other names that you could hear about, and I don't know if these were official or if these were just exploratory conversations. But Austin King, who most recently, I want to make sure I get which one is which right. Austin King was most recently with the Denver Broncos, and then Brandon Nugent, who I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Gus, he was with the Seahawks. He was, with the Seahawks. Those are 2 other names the Jaguars reportedly have reached out to. Again, I don't know if those will be in official interview capacities for offensive line coach or not. But what I can tell you is I'm okay with this too. I am okay with Liam Cohen being intentional because offense coordinator, defense coordinator, offensive line coach, pillars of a franchise. And if you don't get those right, you have set yourself back. And so I am okay with him not leaving any stone unturned and exploring all possible options. And yes, there will be those of you who will hear me say that and go, well, if Kevin Carberry had been available, he just would have, hired him and everything would have been fine. You may be right. I don't know the answer to that, but I would like to believe he's being intentional with all of these conversations. And while yes, as we've been live, I should say, I did have a league source text me and say, now's the time, especially since we all kind of have an idea where the New Orleans Saints situation next week is going to go at this juncture. If you're Liam, you got to start locking guys up because everybody else is going to start locking guys up. So I think there needs to be more of a sense of urgency, but I am okay with him being intentional and trying to identify the right candidate for each position.
Yeah, I hear it. I definitely would have rather him be patient than like just pigeonholed people and be like, oh, I got to get this one specific guy no matter what and do anything I can. Definitely like that he's a little bit more of a patient process and really trying to evaluate what the true best decisions are going to be. But like you said, they do need to start wrapping up some decisions just so that people don't get hired in other places. John Osment said on YouTube, could you talk about what an offensive coordinator does when they're not calling plays? It's a really good question, especially since that's the case in Jacksonville. I would say that a lot of it has to do with installing game plans, whether you're doing tape study and formational tendency studies of the opponent that you're going to face that week, or if you're like reviewing and doing your own self-scouting. If like you say you were going to have this package of plays, then the offense coordinator will probably be in charge of like drawing it up and then communicating those specific plays to various position groups. And so I'm sure there's a ton more responsibilities that I'm not even listing, but there's certainly a lot for an offensive coordinator to do, even when they're not calling plays on Sundays. So with that, Mia, the good news is about the offensive line coach and all of the TBD hires is that, again, I will be back every weekday starting next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Each episode starting at 9:04 a.m. Mia will still be here on Thursdays. Hacker is going to join me on Fridays. Hayes Carline is going to join me on Tuesdays. Wednesday, I'm going to find a rotational national guest. Next week, I'm getting John Ledyard on to talk about what exactly makes Liam Cohen a great offensive play caller and just a great offensive mind. And then Mondays, we'll see what happens on Mondays. Mondays will be for the people probably, but yeah, again, looking forward to
mailbag Monday for the people.
Mondays,
that's the day to interact and get your questions off from the weekend that was.
Absolutely. So I will see everyone here on 9:04 a.m. on Monday. Looking forward to that. Mia, thanks as always for joining. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.